Hello everybody and welcome back. You might notice we're in a little bit of a different garage setup today, and that's because we moved into a different place with a little less salt, a little less humidity, and quite a bit more heat. Now enough about that, let's get into more about why I've been disassembling my turbo assembly out of the engine bay. Now if you'll recall in my last video where I replaced the front mount intercooler in my SR2240SX, my old turbo had quite a bit of turbine shaft play. There's two types of play that you can measure in a turbo. You have radial play, which is where the shaft can move up and down like this on either end. There's also axial play, where the turbine shaft moves in and out. You generally don't want any radial play in your turbo, though a little bit more is allowed in journal bearing turbos as opposed to ball bearing turbos. What you definitely don't want is any axial play. This indicates a very worn turbo that's not going to last very long for you, so that's why we're replacing this one. If you've never had a new turbo before, it can be really hard to judge how much play in that turbine shaft is acceptable. In this case, I'd recommend getting some kind of dial indicator and actually measuring what that play is, both radially and axially, and referencing the factory shop manual and seeing what those clearances are allowed. Now the turbo we've just pulled out of the engine bay is a S15 Spec R turbo, or the 2560R. It's a better turbo than any of the other T28s found in the S14s or the T25s found in the S13s, though it's still considered a T24 against the S14 brothers. The S15 Spec R turbo uses better materials in the turbine blades as well as the turbine housing. Now would be a really good time for me to upgrade my turbo if I wanted to, but I've decided to stick with the GT2560R for mainly a few reasons. One, it's cost effective. I get to purchase just the turbo that I need along with a few other bits and gaskets and whatnot, and keep all of my other settings the same. I get to keep the same fuel injectors. More importantly, I get to keep the same tune and don't have to wait around to send it out to Martin at RS Enthalpy to retune my ECU or take it to one of the local dyno shops here and convert to a standalone and whatnot. So much more cost-effective route for me. Two, it's still a very fun setup. I haven't tired of this turbocharger, this entire engine setup really, while it's been running correctly. To be fair, it hasn't been running correctly for very long, but I do quite enjoy it the way that it is. Number 3, my driver skill just isn't at a point where I feel like I've surpassed the limits of this turbo. I'd really like to get a few more, really just get any track days under my belt with this vehicle and try to explore my driver skill and kind of maybe expand upon that. So gotta make it to the track first before I can make any justifications for a bigger turbo. Long story short, I don't think I've progressed enough in this career mode to unlock those modifications just yet. Real quickly, I want to talk about some of the serial numbers you would find on T28 turbos. The one that happened to be in my car is one of the more common serial numbers you would find, with the latter half of the serial number ending in 91F00. This indicates that the car comes out of a Spec R Nissan Silvia S15. It also indicates that that car was a manual transmission, which means that's the turbo that you want to run if you're sticking with an OEM plus upgrade style turbo. The replacement that I'm going to be using for my old turbo has a serial number that ends in 5004S. I'm not really sure what the origins are or what that number indicates, why it's different from the 91F00, but after a bit of research online, I found that these turbos are exactly the same. It's just a different serial number. I suspect maybe it's a remanufacture turbo. But after a bit of research, I confidently believe that this is the same exact spec turbo that I'm wanting to replace with my old turbo. Now, the journal bearing T28s, which are found in all S14s, late model S15s, and early model S15 automatics, those serial numbers end in 69F00 and 75F00. I think it also includes serial numbers ending in 5001. So keep a lookout for those serial numbers if you're shopping for a turbo, whether it's new or secondhand, though I'd always recommend going with a new turbo. Now, some other parts that I've opted for to kind of help upgrade this entire setup as we're replacing the turbo is some of the better gaskets, including a 7-layer MLS gasket for the exhaust manifold, as well as a 4-layer turbo inlet gasket, which sits between the turbo manifold and the turbo itself. This part's a bit hard to come by. I'm currently on back order from Nissan, who has to order it through Nismo, waiting on that to come in. It's been a month now, who knows how much longer it'll take. Now, I do have a single layer gasket which came with my new Garrett turbo that I could use in place of the 4-layer gasket, which I'm waiting on. But I really like the 4-layer gasket that came out of here. I don't want to reuse it, so I'm going to wait for the new one and go with a better part, because if you could just see the thickness of this gasket, you'd be rest assured that this thing is never going to blow out as long as those studs don't come loose from the exhaust manifold. I've also opted for some heat-resistant turbo lines from Diff. The thing I'm excited for with this new setup is we're going to be moving away from S13 turbo lines onto S14, S15 style turbo lines, where the water return line goes to the front of the engine towards the water neck, rather than towards the back of the engine, routing right next to the turbo elbow. It's not necessarily going to clean things up, but I think it's going to make things much easier to access and give us a little bit more resistance to any turbo leaks that we might have, because I may not be able to tighten that line back in the back of the engine as well as I would have liked to. And one of the other parts that I'm really excited about with this build is the fact that I'm staying with the OEM cast log manifold. Is really good for low torque and drivability, which is what I'm using this car for. Plus, this means I don't have to retune the car. Now, the exciting bit with this exhaust manifold, as you can see, is it's been ceramic coated. I got this coated by a company here in Phoenix, Arizona called Arizona Ceramic Coatings. Did a fantastic job, sandblasted the thing, ceramic coated it in a titanium color, and not only did they do the outside, but he also did the inside. Now, what ceramic coating is good for is it's good at retaining heat. This is going to lower ambient temperatures in my engine bay as we get this thing warmed up and really hot. This engine bay does get really hot, so I'm pretty confident that this ceramic coated turbo manifold is really going to drop temperatures in the engine bay. Now, one of the other important things I'm going to replace, which I think is quite important, are these exhaust manifold washers. Now, these are OEM washers that sits between the exhaust manifold that connects to the head and the nut that fastens them down. Why they're so special is because of their thickness and their ability to absorb heat and keep it away from the nut. That exhaust manifold sees a lot of heat cycles, sees quite a bit of heat, and these nuts help to absorb all of that energy, where it's expands and constricts, expands and constricts multiple times and keeps that nut from seizing onto the exhaust manifold stud itself. When I went to go and do these nuts, I know how much of a pain these exhaust manifolds can be to take off, and I was super surprised with how easy it was because of these nuts on here. So I could probably reuse them. They're still quite thick. I think they're like 5, maybe even 6 millimeters in thickness. Now, on the chance that I can't replace my OEM exhaust manifold washers with more OEM units, I'm going to be using some exhaust manifold washers from Diff. They're not quite as thick, but they are a bit wider in diameter. Bigger in diameter? Either way, they're bigger in diameter, but not quite as thick. I believe these come in at 4 millimeters as opposed to 6 millimeters. Now, one of the last parts that I'm waiting for to come in is a new O2 sensor. And what you should know about my current setup is it's an S13 SR20 running a stock ECU run by RS Enthalpy, tuned by Martin. This means that the fuel management system runs off narrowband rather than a wideband like a lot of standalone ECUs run off of. Now, it's very beneficial to go to a standalone ECU because there's a lot that you can do with it, and I imagine the widebands read a lot more accurate than narrowbands do. Honestly, despite the problems that I've had with this car, I'm quite happy with the stock ECU tuning that Martin's done for me. Someday we'll upgrade to a standalone, but it's out of the budget for now. Now, if you're interested, the main differences between a narrowband and a wideband O2 sensor is their accuracy in reading oxygen levels in your exhaust fumes as they go out your exhaust pipe. Now, in short, there's an ideal air-to-fuel ratio that gets combusted within your combustion chambers and exits throughout your exhaust system. Whatever fuel is unburnt gets passed through your catalytic converter, converts into CO2 and H2O. Now, in short, the main differences between a wideband and a narrowband O2 sensor is how accurately oxygen is measured as in your exhaust fumes as they travel through your exhaust system. Now, widebands are a better option for tuning because they more accurately read your oxygen to fuel ratio that travels through your exhaust system. Basically, everything that's left over from the combustion process, everything that's unburnt, that travels through your exhaust system. Now, the ECU can read signals from this O2 sensor to judge how far off it is from an ideal stoichiometric ratio, or the best ratio that ECU wants to make the most amount of power or have the most efficiency. A narrowband sensor like what I have here is not quite like that. A narrowband sensor, in short, reads if you are above or below that stoichiometric ratio and tries to make adjustments to match up to that. It doesn't tell you how far off you are, it just tells you whether you are above or below that range. Now, the big problem I've found with this setup in particular that I have mainly comes down to an adapter that sits inside the turbo elbow so that I can adapt a skinny O2 sensor, which is required for red top SR20s running a number 62 or 63 ECU. You can't easily run a fat O2 sensor with these engines, unlike all the other SR20s, S14s, S15 engines, late model blacktop S13 engines, because they're quite honestly just made different. They're wired a little bit differently and they send signals differently. In any case, when you don't have a fat O2 sensor, you need to run an adapter so that that O2 sensor will fit inside your turbo elbow. The only problem with this, though, is that this is where the sensor reads all the oxygen within the air that's going through the exhaust system. And this adapter, unfortunately, is just a bit too big for any air to be read accurately by the sensor. Which means this could explain why I've been having all of the problems that I've been having with this car for the past 2 years, 3 years. I do have high hopes for this fix, as it is a really simple, dumb overlook on my part. Hopefully when that new O2 sensor comes in with the proper sized adapter to go into that turbo elbow, it's going to fix all of my problems along with this brand new shiny turbo. That's really all I have for what we're doing to this car. Until more parts come in, I'm kind of at a stalemate at what I can do. So if you guys have any questions about what we're doing here, anything you'd like me to dive into, just let me know and I'll see what I can do for you guys. So look out for part 2 on this turbo replacement, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Have a great day.